This is a presentation on fidelity of implementation for the alternative delivery of specialized services support staff. Here we have a formula for success. When we know what evidence-based practices we're doing for math, behavior, or reading, who and how we're going to be delivering them, where, what situational context, what supportive context, materials, settings, support settings we need, then we can reach the outcomes we're expecting. When we talk about fidelity, that really is defining and measuring who, how, and where this is happening. So fidelity is asking who is delivering the intervention, how are they delivering it, and what supports are in place to help them do that really well. So why fidelity matters is we know that when we have a specific practice, it's either effective or not effective. Most likely, if you're in ADSIS school, you've shown that you've picked an evidence-based practice that has been proven effective. It's research-based and effective. So once you've picked an evidence-based practice, you can either do it in effective ways or ineffective ways. If it's not implemented effectively, it means students are inconsistently receiving it. Maybe that's because they're not consistently attending, or maybe that it's not consistently delivered. There are interruptions into the schedule, the time for intervention is shortened, or there's been a changeover in staffing. The intervention's not sustainable. It's not uncommon that sometimes we pick an intervention that would really take 45 minutes and we shove it into a time slot that it's 25 or 30 or 20 minutes, and so we can't sustain the components of it. There's been one case where the teacher ran out of workbook pages, and so the intervention was not delivered effectively because it wasn't being delivered at the end of the book. And all of that leads to poor outcomes. So we really want to measure the specific practice and the adults who are doing that to see when they're doing it effectively if the students actually benefit. If the students actually benefit from the practice that's delivered well, they'll get better, graduate out of ADSIS, and move back into the core curriculum making progress. If it's delivered ineffectively, we'll blame the practice instead of the implementation supports for it. So before I go on with education, I want to stop and talk about what we're having in the medical field and why this really matters. So there's a huge incidence of complications due to surgery that cropped up many years ago, and they had an intervention of hand washing. So the belief is that hand washing, if there was, would reduce cross-contamination. And when they measured it, only 50% of the healthcare workers were washing their hands consistently. They believed that they needed to attack this by changing individual beliefs. If everyone believes and knows the importance of washing their hands and how important it is to post-surgical wellness and health, they'll do it. So by altering individual beliefs about the urgency and the importance of it should change behavior. Lo and behold, they realized they needed a multimodal support. So they not only needed to educate individuals, health workers, they needed to help change their beliefs, they needed to engage them in it. That now you see, even in hospitals, they'll have cue cards outside of the rooms, they'll have cue cards in the bathrooms with specific steps on how to wash your hands. Even some places will have the steps of a song to make sure you wash it for as long as you need to believe. So interventions of focusing on the individual, focusing on training, ensuring that there are coaches there. So surgical teams have people watching and coaching them on how to wash under the fingernails. They've also added some system supports, alcohol-based solutions, taught health workers more about skincare, because using the alcohol-based solutions dries your hands out, so that curbs the incidence of hand washing. So what they really did to accommodate the behavior of washing hands is they had to take a multi-pronged support. In order to get the individuals to do the behavior of washing hands, they needed training and coaching and education. They needed to alter access to hand washing stations, they needed cue cards, they needed to change solutions that were faster and more accessible before entering the next patient's room. And with measuring that and systematically seeing what barriers are in place, they were able to reduce the contamination in post-surgical care. By getting more people to adhere to the protocols and more effective protocols, they were able to drop the cross-contamination rate and complications of surgery by 98%. A huge effect from a small intervention. The intervention is really about changing adult behavior, and it took more than just training adults. So, what we see is that the hospitals had to define the context. Where does hand washing occur? The conditions under which adults wash their hands or don't wash their hands or are reluctant to wash their hands. They had to change the content of, they had to teach the routines of hand washing. They had to change the kinds of substances that were used in hand washing because it dries hands out, and how to take care of your skin. And then in the competence, they also had to surround people with this culture and people who did a really good job washing their hands. And maybe you've noticed that when you stand next to somebody who's very fastidious about washing their hands, you're a little bit more in tune with how well you do, that social desirability piece. So, when we talk about fidelity, you're going to hear us talk about the context of that when it happens, the content of the what people are doing, and then how effectively people are doing that. I'll give you the healthcare example first because it's a little less personal, but we can see the importance and the urgency of it. Um, Also, with fidelity, it is what you do and the resources or conditions with you do it. It's measuring the critical components and teaching those behaviors. So, when we get back into education, it is teaching adults of how to teach something, how to deliver the intervention. It's using data to continuously inform the training and coaching they receive so they get stronger and better at that. Fidelity is not about catching you doing something right or wrong. It's not about pay for performance. It's not about slavishly following something in a manual, following a script, ignoring student performance. So in the early days, folks might have said, adhere to the curriculum, just follow the curriculum and it will take care of itself. Just follow the program script and it'll take care of itself. But we do know that it's about the critical components and responding to students' data and students' response. When we do that, I'm going to bring us back to this other slide. When we do a practice and we get the outcomes we're looking for, but we have low fidelity, we don't know how you got it. And so it's almost worse to have good outcomes and not know how to replicate that. We have to live in a world where all humans can implement these evidence-based practices. So the reason we're putting so much work into saying how do we deliver that intervention effectively and can that be replicable and sustainable, is to answer the question that you often ask us. What practice works? What should I be doing? And is it really the materials you use, or is it the knowledge you bring, the materials you use, and the context in which you do it that makes a difference? You can go one school over and try to use the same practice, and it may or may not be as effective. It may be because the setting context, the resources, the supports, the culture of the building aren't there. It may be you don't have access to the same data that helped you make improved decisions. So fidelity is about identifying those components so that we can replicate and sustain across time. Heaven forbid we get something that works and the money runs out and we stop doing it. And that's not an uncommon experience either. So we're going to give you some examples now of ways we designed supports to improve performance in math. And so we decided we needed to work with the individuals, but not their beliefs. We needed to find the behaviors that individuals engage in that lead you to improved mathematical practices that students use. We know that that takes a system to support the adults in doing that. We also know that it takes training and coaching. So we're going to walk through the example of our fidelity measure for a number talk and show you how the context, content, and competence is measured and how that's used to inform decisions. So there are two components to our number talk. One is pre-observation, where we walk through the purpose of the fidelity. We establish what it is the teacher really wants to get better at, what her goal is for the number talk. And then we talk about the problem being selected, how the problem will illustrate the number relationships she or he is expecting to pull out, what the teacher is anticipating the students will say or do, and how that could be represented. So this is the content, really understanding what the teacher knows about why she's picking that task and how to deliver that. That's critical. And although this happens in pre-observation as a discussion with the coach or the observer, it will be marked on our fidelity check. And I'll explain a little why later. During the number talk, we look for the critical features that are observable. It's not a slavish following of a script or materials. It is what has to happen in order for students to demonstrate the behavior that we're wanting to see them increase. We note what is observed. So in a lesson in 10 minutes, life can happen. So we're just going to note, do we see it or we not see it? And then that becomes a discussion for later of what we saw, what we didn't see, what was expected and what was unexpected. And we're not counting on a scale of partially, you either see it or you don't see it. And this is because students can't benefit from interventions they don't receive. They either receive that instruction, the adult does it, or the adult doesn't do it. And so when we talk about fidelity, in this instance, we're talking about the component was there so that we see how many of those components are there to know that students will benefit. So here's the example. It's not the entire example, but the first critical component is the selection of the problem and the number talk. And so that's the part that's measured in a pre-observation. If the staff can explain how they picked the right problem, and we talk about it as the just right problem because it establishes those number relationships. Are there multiple points of entry? So these are the components that are illustrated in principles to action, and also the research that leads to effective math instruction. So these are the critical components. These are the descriptors that help explain what that would look like. In the notes section, the observer might write down some additional notes of what they saw that meets that criteria, but looks a little bit different. So in this number talk, it might be that you've demonstrated the criteria. We didn't have a descriptor for that. So we write down those components. Here we're looking at the context. So this piece is unlike the top piece where it's looking at the content. This is the context. Does the teacher wait for 90% of the students to show they're ready with one or more strategies? Does the teacher record answers before explanations are given? Does she or he use nonverbal signals to encourage students to know what they know, to connect their prior knowledge? At this stage of the number talk, it's all about the student thinking, not what the adult has to say. So the fidelity is looking at context here, it's looking at content, and it's also looking at competence. Is the teacher able to guide the discourse without inserting their own thinking, without interrupting students, and maintaining a contribution so every student has a chance to contribute or at least engage in that? And so that is one of the critical pieces too, is to keep students engaged, not just letting one or two people who always have the answer respond. So here's the example of the fidelity. These components would be checked. We would graph how many of the components are present for fidelity, and the coach would go back and say, we're seeing all of the components for selecting the right problem, all of the components for creating the right environment, but we can do more work around engagement. Let's look specifically at how we want to spend some of our time, our coaching session, looking at that, maintaining a high level of engagement. Our next example is a different kind of fidelity measure. It's around team-initiated problem solving. So there's been difficulty in getting teams to engage in effective problem solving. So there's a fidelity check for that. And there's some training around how to do that tier 3 problem solving, tier 2, tier 3 problem solving. In here you'll see items, a variety of items. You'll see what data is being used to do that. This would be a team rating. And they'll give themselves a not in place, a partially in place, or kind of fully. So here you'll see that this is setting the context. Do we have individuals assigned? Are there meeting participants having the right authority to make those decisions? Does the meeting start on time? So these are all the contexts that allow the adults to carry out a good problem-solving meeting. Next, you see the content. Does the problems have solutions that are defined, and do they have a goal? Is there an action plan in the problem-solving meeting? Competent problem solving requires that we have documented solutions. We've looked at and analyzed the data to come through that. So any hypothesis we have has data to verify that. We've generated a solution, and we've defined very precisely what, where, when, how, and then can move on to that. So again, the fidelity is not just about individual competence. It can be about the setting context for the individual to do what they know, the individual including all the content of the intervention, or in this case, problem solving, and how deftly the individual or group does that. So through that, that is how we really define what is replicable. So when we look at fidelity or implementation, if it is high, it will get the expectations we want. We're happy, it's expected, and we can replicate it over and over. If we do something with high fidelity and we don't get the outcomes, we're unhappy, surprised, and we don't want to replicate that. We want to go find another intervention. So this means we might be going back to say, wow, the thing we picked isn't really solving the problem we wanted. If we choose not to measure fidelity or don't use fidelity, we might get the outcome we want. We're happy and we're surprised and we have no idea why. What is it that led us to get that outcome that we expected? So the fidelity data helps us understand, did we get something we expected or unexpected? Can we replicate it or can we not replicate it? With those results, we'll say, okay, high fidelity, we're getting the desirable outcomes, we're going to progress monitor. This is sustainability. If we ever stop measuring fidelity, we see slippage. We see individuals go back to doing what they were wanting to do. Every new year, it's right now, everybody's got their resolutions, they might be taking data, and if they can get through the first 6 weeks, they're inclined to be able to maintain it. That's why there's so many applications out there for weight loss and for meditation that gives you daily feedback on how much of the practice you're doing, and will show you a graph over time. Because we know with data, you're more likely to stick with it, with setting a goal and seeing your progress towards that goal. You'll continue and sustain it. So that's why progress monitoring, even if they've gotten the desired results and people are doing it reliably, you want to maintain that. If you've fallen into low fidelity, you need to understand why. Why are we having low fidelity and still getting good outcomes? Is there something that we're doing that we need to make sure that we're protecting? If we are having low fidelity and we're not getting the outcomes, we need to, instead of getting rid of the intervention, we need to go back and figure out what is it we need to put in place. Did we give sufficient time for the intervention? Is the student attending? How do we increase the student's attendance so that they can benefit from the intervention being delivered? So what do we have to do as adults, and then how are we going to do that to get both the outcomes we want and increase fidelity? If we have high fidelity and not getting the right outcomes, then we need to take a look at that. One example from a few years ago is Read 180 was being implemented in a classroom of 16 students, so one teacher to 16 students. The teacher was doing fine, but the intervention was too big for her to be able to differentiate and use data to make decisions effectively. All the components were in place, but she couldn't sustain that with a large group. The other component is there were a group of kids for whom they weren't ready. They didn't have the requisite knowledge or skills, but it was the only intervention the schools had. And so everybody got that one intervention, and they determined that the intervention wasn't working anymore. Well, under what conditions and when is that practice appropriate for a group of students? So a little bit out of order here, but here's what the data can look like. So for team-initiated problem solving, we're going to measure fidelity multiple times. We might measure it twice a year. In order to get up to fidelity, we might measure it once a year. Here you'll see that the foundations, so the context was higher, and the team problem solved and used the data to improve their problem solving score. By the next time they measured, both scores had gone up, and by the winter of 2014, they hit the fidelity criteria. So the green line was fidelity. This is the big picture. Are we making progress and growing? In order to improve their problem solving, they might have had to have gone down and see where their numbers were falling short. So in the spring of 2013, having a defined goal, looking at fidelity, and having an outcome plan was completely at a zero. Those might be where they looked at the data and said, we need to do some more work to get that in place. Now, if the team-initiated problem solving doesn't seem like a good fit, we have examples for PLCs too. So this is one from a research article a couple of years ago where this is the last component where our teachers using their PLC time to set targets, to look at assessment data, instructional strategies, and so on. So the team would come back together after doing these, the first half monthly. They do this part at each semester to rate how well their PLC is functioning to improve student achievement. So they would rate these items as a team to say, yep, we give ourselves a 3. Every teacher can trace the connection between each classroom lesson and the core curriculum, and we are collaboratively evaluating how effective that is. If that's true, we'll rate ourselves a 3. If almost all the teachers in that team are doing that, they get a 2. If teachers are only doing one or two of the underlined descriptors here, then they get a 1. If they gave themselves a 1, then that might be something they need to figure out how to do more of and improve that in order to get their PLCs to be far more effective. Our last example, so far we've talked about individual fidelity for a specific practice. We've looked at a fidelity measure for team problem solving when our teams need to be more effective. And here we have a tiered fidelity inventory. We have a tiered fidelity inventory for both reading and math. And so this is looking at our system of core instruction, tier 2 instruction, and tier 3. So we're looking at how effective the teams are. So there's some team functioning questions, some implementation of core instruction. Are the resources needed to implement core instruction in place and functioning? And are we using data to improve the resources implementation in our team functioning? So these four subscales are in each of the tiers. Schools make systematic judgments of that and set an action plan. So here's how the data looked. We did, this is pilot data on Tier 1 fidelity from this past year. And so we have 12 schools in 3 different districts who completed the TFI in year 1. And so they did baseline in 2016 and they did a second administration in 2017. And you can see that some schools, actually the schools circled, they got better. They used the data for action planning and improved. Some schools, we are not really sure what happened. They decreased their performance from time 1 to time 2. Maybe they set an action plan and didn't follow through on it or didn't keep measuring. So that's one of the things. Just measuring implementation is a necessary, but it's not sufficient. You have to action plan and you have to make systematic improvements in your action plan in order to get better. The note is this school hit fidelity on tier 1 and fidelity on tier 2, and they actually saw their student achievement rise. So we've taken that 4 box where it's not done well, it's done very well, and said, okay, can we start saying that maybe it's not just high fidelity and low fidelity, maybe there's different gradients. So if we plot out how our fidelity is moving kids forward, we'll hopefully be up here in this direction, and we're going to hopefully make systematic improvement. MD uses this grid to track multiple schools' progress across time, and although we'd like it to be a straight line from not being measured to being measured, schools doing high fidelity and exceeds, we see that the pattern isn't that way. What we see is that fidelity will increase, and after there's a bit of a lag, so fidelity increases and then students start to make growth, and then fidelity can increase and then students can start to make growth. What we're seeing in reality is it isn't a straight shot of like high fidelity automatically gets you to high rates of growth. It's a step process. So as teachers, why do you care? This looks like it's been about administrators and leaders. But we think that we all get out of bed to be really effective. So we're picking interventions that are proven to work. We expect that when we do them and do them well, they will work. If we don't know how to do them well, and I don't know about you, but it's happened more than once that I got training and I went to start on it and it didn't go the way I expected. So if somebody's measuring how well I'm doing it in order to provide more training and or tailored coaching, that's only going to improve my ability to deliver that intervention well and see kids do better. Fidelity also helps us slow down the pace of adoption. We know that we tend to be on implementation cycles of here's a new thing and I'm going to do that for the 2017-2018 school year. And next year I'll get a new practice that I'm supposed to implement. Um, so we see the act of adopting evidence-based practices exceeding the pace of human capacity to do and do well. So measuring fidelity and holding course to we're not going to do another practice until we've got this really well. And we're going to keep measuring so that I'm not only doing PBIS Tier 1 implementation, but when we layer in the next level of social emotional interventions and proactive developing of social literacy and social skills, that I'm maintaining those high expectations. I'm making sure that I'm teaching what I expect students to do, and I'm also teaching them how to think about and how to respond in a socially appropriate way. Those two come together. It's not uncommon that we might implement PBIS and then folks go, oh, I don't have to do that anymore because now we're on to the next thing. Nope, we're always going to do that. So by measuring fidelity over time, we can make sure that people don't slip backwards and we have to go back. As you saw, when we look at the data, we can see what has to happen. Individuals might be doing the practices, but they don't have a supportive context. We might need to pull students at a different time of day. We might need to protect more of the intervention sessions from interruptions and changes in the schedule. So it'll help us make accurate decisions. We don't need to throw an intervention out and start over if it's really an issue that can be dealt with in terms of scheduling, dealt with in terms of location, or dealt with in terms of resource application. The other thing is it helps us refocus what's in our control. Instead of blaming the learner or blaming a different context, what is it that I can do today to make this intervention more effective for a student? So the more specific the training is, the more specific in terms of what is expected of me and how I do that well, the more likely students are to get better. We think it's also important to demystify and think of fidelity as being less stressful. We know out in the community, this pay for performance and teacher evaluation could possibly be getting muddled with fidelity. Fidelity is really about improving the training and supports for me as a teacher or an administrator or a member of a problem-solving team. So if I'm being trained on something, I would like to see that the critical components that I'm going to be measured on are in the training. We have learned this past year to include the fidelity measure in the training to show the teacher what the critical components are, even to reboot the training so that every component in there is trained and folks, it's so explicit they can see it. There might even be videos where folks can score other practitioners so they can see the critical features in practice and see what that looks like. Another component is allowing adults to have practice with the fidelity. So either watching a coach model the instruction and use the fidelity check so that you make sure you're seeing the critical features and how that's delivered and what it can look like. This is about substance, not about style. So how does that person do it guides your discussion, your debrief of what you saw the coach do or the peer model do, and then how you can talk about what is substantive versus stylistic difference. So using fidelity checks to guide observation and questioning, it's not uncommon to be more comfortable to videotape yourself and then rate yourself on the fidelity check or have a peer you trust do that. We know that we hate watching ourselves. I detest watching my own self, but if I'm given a fidelity check and I can watch for specific things, did this happen or did that happen, it gets over the aversiveness of seeing myself on the screen. But that might also make having somebody else come into your room more comfortable for you to do that. The other component that will make the fidelity check less stressful is that we are also looking at how quickly you get specific and explicit feedback. So it will work. The feedback has to help you understand what areas to improve, and it has to be within your control. Or it has to give you, oh, here's the context in which we need to bring this back to a team to make sure time is protected, to make sure these resources available. The difference between what we thought is in place and what is in place, that that has to be addressed. So by looking at Fidelity, we can not only provide training and coaching, but we can also put some supports in place to ensure that you can deliver that practice more effectively and with fidelity. And it's not personal, it is about supporting the system. So that's all we had for you today. We gave you 4 different examples of fidelity tools. We have some more resources for you. On the very first slide was my email, and you're welcome to email me any further questions you have about fidelity. And this will be part of an ongoing conversation.